What's up, guys? It's your boy Zowoki back out with another Chris Watts video. And apparently, from informants that I know of, they're actually stating that Chris Watts thinks he's got loopholes because of what he's been finding on the internet. I can't make this up. Apparently, Chris is trying to find any little way to show that he was not able to stand trial because of his not knowing of certain rights he had, as in not knowing he was able to ask for a lawyer. He did not ask for any legal aid, aka a representative. That's the way it's been told. There's other things that Chris Watts has been told that he was told how to say his confession. It's not the real confession still. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And apparently through images that YouTube people are sending him in prison, he's using these to benefit himself in trying to get out. Yeah, I don't know how this is possible. Like, he thinks he's going to still get... He's trying every little way to try to get out. And I'm definitely game to watch and listen. I've been told by some informants that I do know, because they work there as correctional officers, and have stated that in passing, this is what Chris has been asking or telling. With that being said, let's get into this video together. But first, if you guys could do me a solid favor and subscribe to my YouTube channel by hitting that wiper icon down at the bottom right, or wherever it keeps moving. It says subscribe, hit that bell icon next to it, so when I do post videos like this one, you guys will get that little ring notification that Zowoki myself has posted that video, and then you guys can watch, comment, like, and share. And I want to state that we are going to watch a video from Secret in the Dark, loopholes and Netflix things that were never saw in the Watts family murders that apparently Chris is going to be using, how all of this started, and so forth. I want to reiterate that from all the legal points of views that I have talked to today, there's no way for Chris to get out. The only way that Chris is going to get out is in a body bag, or if the second coming of Christ comes and he's one of the ones that are taken, or is one of the ones that after the second coming happens, the infrastructure of the world will fall, and then prisoners will get released and so forth, and things are not going to go well, apparently. So that's the only way this man's getting out. So I want to reiterate that a lot of people do get worried that another person like him could get out. I mean, when you have cases like the Casey Anthony case, where this woman legitimately has all the evidence that supports against her that she's the one that murdered this little girl, but is walking free. I mean, we have other murderers that have been throughout different cases. I can't remember them offhand, but you can type in murderers that have been set free. It's just it's a shocker, to say the least. But again, with this man having 3 life sentences concurrently, and then also having a 44 years on the unlawful termination of a child or a baby infant, yeah, there's no way this man's getting out. So let's get into the video. Again, let's be respectful, let's be debatable, and let's see if this is fact, fake, you know, all the deals. Again, this man is not getting out. I just want to reiterate that. Well, let's watch.
Nice to meet you. So we're just waiting for our sergeant to come over, and we'd like to go through your house. Are you okay with us searching through your house? All right. We'll have you sign a consent form. We just want to see if you left a note or anything inconspicuous, something like that.
All right.
So if you're good with that, we'll have you sign a consent form allowing us to search your house, and we'll wait for our sergeant to get here. But we'll grab that. You don't plan on going anywhere, right?
No, I was just going to walk around the neighborhood just to clear my head.
Justice does not always come from the courtroom. Sometimes it comes from asking the questions nobody else dares to ask. In August 2018, America was introduced to a story that seemed impossible. A pregnant woman and her 2 little girls vanished from their Colorado home, and the man who appeared on television to beg for their safe return turned out to be the one who had silenced them forever. But if you stop at that headline, you miss the real.
That's the thing, is they want to say that if they want to stop there, can he be tried on a confession or sent to prison on a confession? So this is what Chris is trying to get at right here, is yes, a person can be jailed after confessing without a formal trial, but also be how do I say this? He wants to say that because of his confession not being 100% true, he can't be jailed because he never was given a formal trial. Lack of evidence, they didn't go through evidence. Coerced or false confessions, he could try to say, yeah, this was my false confession, Nicole Kessinger was involved. That could be a possibility. I've been told that if Chris Watts confessed, which I think he kind of did with his "my Jezebel led me astray," is he actually telling us in physical orientation, or is it completely metaphorical and he's just trying to say it to kind of say that she was involved but not involved? You know what I'm saying? So if he says, yeah, she was involved or she helped, false confession would have to be retried and re-investigated, which it wasn't investigated to begin with. The plea deal, a person might plead guilty but later overturn the conviction, or the prosecutors might drop charges if the confession is unreliable. Could this possibility happen where Chris Watts says, yeah, it was Nicole, she was there, she helped me? Who knows? There have been very minimal instances where this has happened. I've researched it. It's happened, but not a lot. Some people just stick with what they had and they don't care what the outcome is anymore. They might get 1 life sentence, but they're still the main catalyst in that murder, but their sentence might be reduced because Chris was obviously the main squeeze in there, where, again, we think that there was a main squeeze part 2, Nicole Kessinger, but maybe she was more of a, not bystander, but a sidekick instead of the actual number 2 of the death of the family, but she had hands-on, as in removing evidence and getting rid of text messages and so forth like that. So again, if Chris Watts said, yeah, I lied in my confession, she was there, coerced, I mean, he could try. Is it going to happen? Again, I'm not in the professional field, but I'm just saying that it is there, but it's very, very minimal. You're more likely to get pregnant with a condom, okay, than Chris Watts getting out of prison. You're more likely, for people that are not astronauts, you guys would be the ones that get sent to space on the National Space Station. You have more chances of getting there than Chris getting out. So if that makes anything visual learner, so let's continue.
Real story. You miss the contradictions, the psychological breaks, the subtle lies that slipped through unnoticed. This isn't about what Chris Watts did. You've already heard that. This is about the questions he never answered and the loopholes that reveal who he really was. Chris Watts was not the kind of man who drew attention. He wasn't the loud one at parties. He wasn't the type to dominate conversations or show off his temper.
Sounds like
He was quiet, reserved, polite. The kind of man who blends into the background. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling part. When we think of killers, especially men who wipe out their entire families, we imagine volatility. Police records of domestic fights, neighbors hearing shouting through the walls, a history of violence that builds toward a predictable end. But Chris didn't fit that pattern. In fact, he seemed to be the opposite. Coworkers described him as friendly, a mechanic who would lend a hand without complaint.
It could be your mailman. It could be your yoga instructor. I mean, it could be anybody that you know, even close to you, your husband, your wife. I'm not saying watch them like a hawk and you're like, like this all the time. No, I'm just telling you to look for the signs. Always keep your head on a swivel, as we called it in the military, as you're always looking around. Yes, you want to get comfortable, but you also want to be on the prowl. There is this girl that today that we watched in the body cam footage, had an 8-year-old girl just out of nowhere snapped and murdered her daughter. I mean, I'm seeing all these, I mean, you need to be on the lookout. Evil exists in every nook and cranny. This guy was your Joe Schmo, awesome dude that, yeah, maybe was a little less dominant in his relationship with his marriage, but yet was still a person that definitely looked like they worked hard or trying to be the best father, the best brother, or not best brother because they didn't really talk, best son. He was trying to be that hardworking man. And then this happened. Again, that other case with the pastor that murdered his wife to be with that mistress. It's a pastor, somebody that gives faith or gives you direction in religion and of all the fields of choice to be more honest and have the best what's that word? Initiation, not initiation. I want to say an initiation, but an intuitive integrity. And then it's all gone within an hour, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 30 seconds. It just changes everything. And I want you to be on the lookout. Again, don't be freaking out and be like watching everything your man or your woman does or whatever. Just always be on, as they say, trust but verify. But you always want to trust. You want to trust, but you always want to be cautious. If that is what I'm saying. I just don't want you guys to freak out about it.
Neighbors remembered him mowing the lawn, waving politely, never making trouble. To the outside world, he seemed almost too normal. And that's why this case is so because it forces us to confront a darker truth. Sometimes the danger isn't in the men who shout. Sometimes it's in the men who never speak.
Can't be safe ever.
Psychologists call this passive pathology. It is not the anger that explodes outward and bursts. It is the anger that hides in silence, bottled up in a person who doesn't know how to express conflict, doesn't know how to assert needs, doesn't know how to face confrontation. Chris avoided arguments. Shanann, his wife, was outspoken, driven, unafraid to speak her mind. Their personalities couldn't have been more different. She was expressive, always documenting her life online, sharing her struggles and her joys. He was the opposite, quiet, reserved, fading into the background of her spotlight.
He said.
But avoidance comes at a cost. Every time Chris failed to speak, failed to push back, failed to show anger in the moment, that energy didn't vanish. It stayed with him. It accumulated. And the more Shanann expressed herself, the more Chris retreated inward. People often mistake passivity for peace, but silence can be just as dangerous as rage. When someone refuses to communicate, when someone hides behind a mask of calm, pressure builds inside, until one day it ruptures. This is the hidden psychology of men like Chris Watts, the men who smile quietly while planning an escape, the men who never throw plates against the wall, but instead rehearse fantasies of freedom in their heads.
He was like that kid that when the mom and dad slammed the door, he'd be the one that flips off the door and like, I don't like you. You suck. Oh my gosh. He was the one that was doing all that kind of stuff behind the door. Never said anything to his parents, kept quiet, but he was the one that was hiding behind the door, making all those facial features. Or probably punching his pillow. Yeah, I'm so mad at you, Mom, Dad.
Men who do not confront reality, they erase it. Chris wasn't just escaping a marriage. He was escaping the self he couldn't bear to be anymore. Husband in debt, father under stress, man who didn't feel in control of his own life. And when people like Chris finally act, they don't just walk away, they eliminate. They rewrite the story by destroying the characters who remind them of the truth. This is why Chris Watts does not fit into the usual categories of domestic violence. He wasn't the classic abuser whose cruelty escalates in public.
He's like that guy from that movie Stepfather, where the stepfather comes in, plays the father role, but then secretly is planning their murders or like serial murders. Again, Stepfather, totally different, not blood related, but still the guy was sitting in there earning their trust, and then he murders them. It's like he got a thrill off of that.
He was something more chilling, a man whose violence emerged only at the very end, as the final expression of a life lived in denial. So when you hear neighbors describe him as polite, when you see coworkers say he was helpful, when you watch his calm face on television, you are not seeing contradictions.
Could you see him
You
getting
are
mad?
seeing the mask. And beneath that mask was a man.
He's like the meh emote. It does this all the time. That's all he does.
Who could not tolerate being exposed for who he truly was. Pause. Reflective question.
Yes.
If danger can wear such an ordinary face, how many other masks walk quietly among us?
That's creepy.
The morning Shanann went missing, Chris told Nicole Atkinson that Shanann had taken the kids to a play date. A simple explanation. Too simple. Here's the psychology behind that choice. When liars are cornered, they often reach for the least imaginative lie possible.
Oh, like NK did all the time?
The goal isn't to invent a story, it's to end the questions. But Chris forgot the psychology of Shanann's life. She lived through her phone, every appointment documented.
And apparently that was wrong because Chris wanted some time with her and she was just always on the phone. Yeah, she could be on the phone. Just come over and just have some fun with her. I mean, she's not always on the camera. Like, he always wanted everything to be about him. Me, secretly. And, because Shanann is boisterous, she's completely at fault. Chris was also at fault. This was a 50-50 issue. I'm not saying Shanann was perfect in the marriage, but she was at least trying to save it, fix it. Maybe she did know that she worked too much, but she was doing it for her family and for her to expand her business. But my God, she does that. She's the biggest villain ever. All of you guys would be looking out for your family and yourself, but yet you jump on this woman because she does it? How dare she? But I'm going to be the same way.
Every play date photographed, every detail shared with friends. He underestimated how quickly Nicole and investigators would sense that his explanation didn't fit Shanann's personality. And then came the neighbor's footage. Chris claimed he was loading tools into his truck, but he backed the vehicle into the garage, blocking the view, pacing back and forth.
It wasn't just suspicious behavior. It was psychologically revealing. Chris wasn't practiced at deception. He hadn't thought through how his actions looked to others. That morning, Chris was already unraveling. His first lie set the stage for every contradiction that would follow. When Chris Watts stood in front of the cameras, the world expected to see panic. His pregnant wife and 2 daughters
He
were
just
missing.
stood there.
Reporters gathered on the lawn. Neighbors watched from across the street. The moment demanded urgency. But instead of desperation, Chris delivered something else entirely. Calm. His shirt was neat. His hair was combed. His voice barely wavered.
He didn't have any.
And in
fear.
that calmness was the most disturbing clue of all. In psychology, this is known as affective constriction, an emotional flatness often seen when someone distances themselves from their own actions.
Oh, like NK?
It is not the absence of feeling, but the suppression of it, a flattening of affect to preserve the self.
Or why?
Most people who lose a loved one can't help but show it. Their bodies betray their words, the trembling of hands, the tears that break through, the raw panic in their voice. But Chris presented the opposite. He stood stiff, controlled, almost rehearsed. And listen closely to what he chose to emphasize. He didn't say, "Please help me find my family." He didn't say, "Shanann, if you see this, call me." Instead, he said they'd had an emotional conversation the night before she vanished.
Nope.
Think about that.
Don't believe it at all.
In the most crucial moment, his mind wasn't on finding them. It was on shifting the narrative. He was reframing the story, planting a seed of blame, suggesting to the world that Shanann may have left. This is called externalization of responsibility. For Chris, it wasn't about grief. It wasn't even about fear. It was about protecting the mask,
Throws it away.
the image of himself as the reasonable one, the calm one.
Why is that everybody's image that they're worried about? Like that pastor that murdered his wife. He did that because he didn't want the image of adultery instead of murder. They're both terrible. Now he thought he was going to get away with murder instead of the adultery. And this guy, Chris Watts, thinking he can get away with adultery by eliminating the first version.
The victim
How
of
does
a
that make
wife who walked
sense?
away. But here's the contradiction, the loophole most people miss. When people externalize blame in public, they usually overdo it. They reveal the very motive they're trying to hide. By pointing to the marriage, Chris was admitting, without admitting, that the marriage was the core of the crisis. Body language experts noticed something else. As he spoke, he folded his arms across his chest, rubbed his
Self-soothing.
neck, and looked away. These weren't signs of a man consumed by grief.
And Nicole Kessinger did the exact same thing, but yet, oh, she's not involved.
They were signs of a man consumed by himself, worried about how he appeared, worried about what others thought. And yet the interviews worked, in one sense. To casual viewers, he
I
seemed
think it
composed,
screwed him.
rational, the kind of man you could trust. But to investigators, that calmness rang like an alarm bell. Because calm men in
Ring, 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 ring. I'm stupid. What I was
chaos
doing for Chris.
rarely are what they seem.
What's more chilling? A man who falls apart when his family is gone, or a man who looks directly into the camera and never sheds a tear? Chris Watts walked into the polygraph room with confidence. He had already
Cute
spoken
smile.
calmly on television. He had deflected questions from friends. Now, sitting across from the FBI, he believed he could do the same. And that belief tells us something about his mind. Most guilty men avoid polygraphs. They fear the exposure. They demand lawyers.
He thought he was going to be able to beat the... He told his teacher, I'm a good liar. I made her believe that I went to China. Like, okay. Good one.
They resist. But Chris did the opposite.
Or he thought because he had like no emotion, that his heart is not going to show emotion. Like your face and your heart. Again, I don't think Chris had a heart because he was able to do this, but scientifically, he probably cared for his kids, but in this moment, he was just like, I need to remove everything. But again, I'm not saying that he's without cause to be why he's where he's at, but it's just, I don't know. I feel like he's still manipulated by Nicole in some shape or form. I wouldn't say like the whole mystic abilities, but that's what made him think that this was the actual right answer.
He volunteered. Psychologists call this optimistic bias, the false
words
belief
here.
that we are smarter than the system, that we can outthink the test. But in Chris's case, it was something deeper. It was narcissistic self-concept. He had convinced himself that if he projected calm, if he kept his story short, the machine would bend to his will. But polygraphs
Idiot.
don't measure words. They measure the body. The spikes in heart rate, the sweat of the palms, the catch in the breath when the truth collides with the lie. Here's the loophole most videos never explain. Polygraphs don't just give a pass or fail, they score. A truthful person typically scores +2
3.
or higher. A deceptive person scores -4 or lower. Chris scored -18.
Or 18.
That is not just deception, that is catastrophic deception.
Sucks at lying.
It is so extreme that examiners later said it was rare to see a score so low. It meant Chris wasn't just lying, he was lying with every fiber of his body. And yet, even when the results were revealed, Chris didn't explode in panic. He didn't demand to leave. He didn't crumble instantly. Instead, he kept insisting, "I did not lie on this test."
See, like, if he lied on the test, he probably should have got a lawyer. I mean, even in the beginning, if it were me, which, again, it wouldn't be me because I wouldn't have gone this route, but if it would be me and let's say I'm in that predicament where I would have to figure out what's my next step, they would be like, oh, we need to question you, Chris, about the whereabouts where you think, and when they start going south, I'd be like, I want my lawyer. But again, I wouldn't be in this predicament because I wouldn't be this stupid.
That denial in the face of impossible evidence shows a classic psychological defense: compartmentalization. Chris had built a mental wall between his actions and his self-image. On one side of the wall, the husband, the father, the neighbor. On the other, the killer. To admit the truth would shatter the mask. So even with the numbers on the screen, he clung to the lie. And here's where the psychology of interrogation matters. Agent Tammy Lee didn't confront him with aggression. She leaned in with a soft, almost maternal voice. She told him gently, "It would be really stupid for you to be here if you had something to do with their disappearance." That's not just interrogation strategy. That's psychological leverage. Because men like Chris, men who fear confrontation, are more likely to crack under comfort than under pressure. They don't respond to shouting, they respond to empathy. And Tammy used that empathy like a scalpel.
For hours, she and Agent Coder pressed, not by screaming, but by showing him pictures of his family, by asking him to imagine their faces, by reminding him of their shoes, their clothes, their laughter. The pressure wasn't external, it was internal. They forced him to sit in the silence he had spent years avoiding. And slowly, the mask began to slip. Chris had walked into the polygraph room believing he could beat the system. Instead, the system exposed what he really was.
And then he wants to use that he was coerced into saying what he said, and that the lie detector was, we've heard in that one interview with his lawyer, that he didn't get enough sleep, that he was not at his fit moment. He's trying every loophole under the sun to get out.
A man who believed his calmness was stronger than truth itself. When Chris Watts finally broke, it wasn't under the FBI's relentless questions. It wasn't under the weight of the polygraph results. It wasn't even when investigators told him the evidence pointed directly at him. It was when his father walked into the room.
Not just him.
That single choice, to ask for Ronnie Watts before telling the truth, reveals more about...
Oh, you know who else wanted Ronnie Watts? Nicole Kessinger Googled Ronnie Watts the day of the murders. She wanted apparently Ronnie Watts for what? We don't know.
Out Chris's psychology than hours of interrogation ever could. Most men in crisis either withdraw completely or confess under overwhelming pressure.
He
But
confessed to
Chris
his
did
dad.
something different. He sought out parental permission. He wanted his father beside him, not to protect him, but to validate him. Psychologists call this emotional regression. In moments of extreme stress, adults sometimes retreat to childlike states, looking for authority figures to
Save me,
absorb
Dad.
responsibility. For Chris,
Oh, like NK did when she had her father and her daddy in the interview room? What a joke.
who had spent years avoiding conflict with Shanann,
Those two know that they were there as a joke, and they know it.
this was his final avoidance. Let his father carry the weight of the truth. Listen to the words. Chris didn't launch into a full confession. He whispered. He stumbled. He leaned on Ronnie, letting him guide the conversation. His voice wasn't the voice of a man owning his actions.
He's trying to say that he didn't do it, but he's taking the rap. Like, he still can't confess.
It was the voice of a boy admitting
100%.
he'd done something wrong.
He can't do that right.
And Ronnie's reaction, calm, subdued, almost protective, is just as revealing. Instead of confronting Chris with outrage, instead of demanding he tell the investigators everything, Ronnie sat quietly. He nodded. He gave space. That quietness has disturbed many observers. Why didn't Ronnie press him? Why didn't he demand
His son?
honesty? The answer lies in protective denial. For many parents, when faced with the possibility that their child has done the unthinkable, the instinct isn't to fight the truth, it's to shield, to preserve the relationship at any cost, even if that means absorbing the weight of the crime in silence. In that room, we see two psychological defenses colliding. Chris regressing into a childlike state, unable to face his actions without his
Save me,
father's
Dad.
presence. Ronnie retreating into denial, unable to force his son to face the enormity of what he'd done. And in that space of silence, Chris found the courage not to tell the full truth, but to tell a version of it. A version where Shanann hurt the children and he reacted. For hours, she and Agent coalesced, not by screaming, but by showing him pictures of his family, by
He
asking him
pointed
to
it.
imagine their faces, by reminding him of their shoes, their clothes, their laughter. The pressure wasn't external, it was internal. They forced him to sit in the silence he had spent years avoiding. And slowly, the mask began to slip. Chris had walked into the polygraph room believing he could beat the system. Instead, the system exposed what he really was, a man
We call that a smart donkey, if you know what I mean. I don't swear, so if you know what the donkey is. He thought he was all that in a bag of chips. Secretly.
who believed his calmness was stronger than truth itself. When Chris Watts finally broke, it wasn't under the FBI's relentless questions. It wasn't under the weight of the polygraph results. It wasn't even when investigators told him the evidence pointed directly at him. It was when his father walked into the room. That single choice, to ask for Ronnie Watts before telling the truth,
But why? That's the other thing, too, is why did Nicole Google Ronnie? That still bothers me. I try to figure out any way of why she would have Googled Ronnie. Unless Chris, like, Googled him for some reason on her phone. I don't know. Because he didn't have a phone. I don't know. I try any little loophole that I'm trying to figure out that why, or not loophole, but why NK would be Googling Ronnie Watts. She Googled Saratoga Trail for one, we all know what, for one reason, is to go there, how to get there. Ronnie Watts. Yeah.
reveals more about Chris's psychology than hours of interrogation ever could.
And that's in the discovery. That's public info right there.
Most men in crisis either withdraw completely or confess under overwhelming pressure. But Chris did something different. He sought out parental permission. He wanted his father beside him, not to protect him, but to validate him. Psychologists call this emotional regression. In moments of extreme stress, adults sometimes retreat to childlike states, looking for authority figures to absorb responsibility. For Chris, who had spent years avoiding conflict with Shanann, this was his final avoidance. Let his father carry the weight of the truth. Listen.
Chris is not going to be able to go to his parents' funerals, all the stuff that he's going to miss out.
Listen to the words. Chris didn't launch into a full confession. He whispered. He stumbled. He leaned on Ronnie, letting him guide the conversation. His voice wasn't the voice of a man owning his actions. It was the voice of a boy admitting he'd done something wrong. And Ronnie's reaction, calm, subdued, almost protective, is just as revealing. Instead of confronting Chris with outrage, instead of demanding he tell the investigators everything, Ronnie sat quietly. He nodded. He gave space. That quietness has disturbed many observers. Why didn't Ronnie press him? Why didn't he demand honesty? The answer lies in protective denial. For many parents, when faced with the possibility that their child has done the unthinkable, the instinct isn't to fight the truth, it's to shield, to preserve the relationship at any cost, even if that means absorbing the weight of the crime in silence. In that room, we see two psychological defenses colliding. Chris regressing into a childlike state, unable to face his actions without his father's presence. Ronnie retreating into denial, unable to force his son to face the enormity of what he'd done. And in that space of silence, Chris found the courage not to tell the full truth, but to tell a version of it. A version where Shanann hurt the children and he reacted.
Version where responsibility was shared, not shouldered. Even in his confession, he was still avoiding, still externalizing, still shifting blame. For investigators, it was a breakthrough. But for psychologists, it was something else. Proof that Chris Watts had never truly grown into his own moral accountability. Even at the darkest moment of his life, he leaned on his father to absorb the unbearable. What does it mean when a man can end his family's lives, but still needs his father to hold his hand before admitting it? When Chris Watts finally told investigators where to look, he led them to an oil field. Remote, industrial, a place where noise and machinery drowned out silence. For years, Chris had worked in the oil industry. He knew the tanks, he knew the fields, and in his mind, this was the perfect place to erase the truth. But the choices he made there were something he never intended. Psychologists studying criminal staging talk about the difference between organized offenders and disorganized offenders. The organized plan ahead, anticipate details, control the scene. The disorganized act impulsively, leaving contradictions behind. Chris thought he was organized. He brought Shanann wrapped in bedding. He drove the girls in his truck. He chose a site miles away from his neighborhood. But what investigators found told another story. Near Shanann,
it shows half intelligence and half not. It shows different personalities.
Shannon's shallow grave, a sheet was discovered. It matched the missing bedding from the Watts home. Here's the contradiction. If he had wrapped Shanann in it, why wasn't it still with her body? Why discard it nearby, in the open? Why not bury it deeper? Why leave the very item that tied her back to the house?
In the field.
This is the psychology of unraveling. When adrenaline fades, when the fantasy collides with reality, even the most calculated plan collapses. Chris wasn't in control. He was improvising, making clumsy decisions that betrayed him later. And his method of disposal was just as telling. Shanann was placed in a shallow grave. Bella and Celeste were forced into separate oil tanks. To many, these were practical choices, ways to hide evidence. But to psychologists, they carry symbolic weight. The tanks where he worked every day represented his double life. The job where he was dependable, quiet, competent, the mask he wanted to preserve. By placing his daughters there, he fused his crime with his workplace, almost as if burying his guilt inside the one environment.
Do you agree with that, guys? I'm just curious.
Where he still felt in control. But guilt leaks, always, and that discarded sheet was the proof. Criminologists often say that no crime scene is perfect because no mind is perfect. Staging is never flawless. There is always a detail, a contradiction, something left
behind. For Chris, it was the sheet, a symbol of his attempt to tidy up chaos, but also a symbol of his failure. And when investigators saw it lying there, separate from Shanann's grave, they knew exactly what it meant.
And people want to say that this guy is Cece's dad. How?
Chris Watts hadn't planned as carefully as he thought. He wasn't organized. He wasn't in control. He was desperate. If a man can plan the erasure of his family, but still leave the evidence of his crime beside them, was it ever really control, or was it always collapse? 4-year-old Bella Watts was small, but she was not silent. The autopsy revealed defensive injuries, marks that told investigators she had fought back against her father, scratches, bruising, signs of resistance in a child who should have been safe in her father's arms. And yet, no neighbors reported hearing screams, no cries, no desperate sounds piercing the walls of that suburban home. This is what psychologists call the silence loophole. How could Bella fight back, and yet the house remain quiet? The answer is as chilling as it is revealing. Chris may have restrained her before silencing her. He may have muffled her cries, or he may have lied about the timeline altogether, leaving investigators and the public with a version of events designed to conceal just how brutal that final struggle was. Because here's the truth most overlook. Resistance is not just physical, it is psychological. For a man like Chris, who lived...
So are they saying that Chris wants to get off on the idea that he's giving his family and the public this story when it didn't happen? Like, oh, after I committed the murder of Cece, Bella pretty much begged for her life by saying, is that what you're going to do? What did this Cece to me kind of thing? Is he trying to implement that, psychologically tormenting his victims? I don't know. Am I looking too far into that? I'm just curious.
Lived his life avoiding conflict, Bella's resistance wasn't just inconvenient, it was unbearable. It was the ultimate confrontation. His daughter refusing to disappear quietly. In that moment, Chris faced the one thing he had spent his life avoiding: direct opposition. And it came not from his wife, not from investigators, but from a 4-year-old child who trusted him most. Psychologists describe this as ruptured fantasy. Offenders like Chris construct an internal story about control. They imagine the crime will unfold quickly, neatly, without complication. But when the victim resists, when they fight back, the fantasy collapses. Rage fills the gap. The act becomes more violent, more desperate. And that desperation leaves scars, not just on the body, but on the narrative itself. Chris would later tell investigators that everything was quiet, that he left the house with no disturbance. But Bella's injuries contradict that. They are the physical evidence of the one truth Chris could never erase, that his daughter did not go willingly. Her final moments hold a psychological weight far greater than evidence alone. Bella represents the rupture of the mask. She represents confrontation. She represents the truth breaking through the silence he had lived behind.
And perhaps that is why, in his later prison confession, Chris admitted hearing her words echo in his head. Daddy, no.
It's haunting
Not
him.
once, not twice, but every night when he tried to close his eyes.
I hope it does.
For psychologists, this detail is telling. Offenders rarely dwell on their victims' words. They push them down, suppress them, rewrite them. But Chris repeated Bella's words himself, as if haunted, as if, even in prison, he could not escape the moment she looked at him and recognized betrayal. That is not just memory, that is punishment. A punishment his own mind will deliver long after the courts have done their part. If the last words your child ever said were a plea against your own hands, how could you ever sleep again? Chris Watts never
Well, he
went
sleeps
to
on a mat
trial.
that's probably like
He
this
never
thick.
sat through the endless cross-examinations, the evidence
Cold.
projected on courtroom screens, the witnesses called one by one. He avoided it all. Instead, he accepted a plea deal. Life in prison, no possibility of parole. For Shanann's family, the deal meant certainty. He would never walk free.
The Ruseks are living a life of, or not conviction, but corrections. They don't get to see their daughter. They lost they're in their own prison,
But for Chris, it meant
including
something
Frankie
else.
Jr.
Avoidance. Psychologists describe this as minimization by surrender. For some offenders, a trial is unbearable, not because of the potential outcome, but because of the exposure. Trials force offenders to face their own contradictions in public. Every lie is dissected. Every hidden detail is dragged into the light. For a man like Chris, a man who had lived behind silence and masks, that was the one confrontation he could not endure. So he chose the option that kept him hidden, the option that ended questions, the option that avoided the theater of accountability. By pleading guilty, Chris preserved a fragment of control. He would not have to explain himself. He would not have to hear the full weight of evidence against him. He could skip the part of justice that demands answers. And yet, in skipping trial, another contradiction emerged, one that most people never paused to consider. Shanann was pregnant, 15 weeks along. The baby already had a name, Niko. But in Colorado, unborn children are not recognized as murder victims. So the charge Chris faced for Niko's death was not homicide. It was unlawful termination of a pregnancy.
Messed up, man.
A legal technicality.
I think that's
A
murder.
phrase that reduces a son with a name to a condition of his mother's body. For Shanann's family, that was salt in the wound. To them, Niko was real. They had dreamed of him, spoken his name, prepared for his arrival. But in the eyes of the law, he was paperwork.
This is what psychologists call a secondary trauma, when the legal system itself re-injures the family of victims. To hear their unborn grandson described not as a person, but as an unlawful termination was a pain layered on top of grief. And for Chris, it offered another loophole, another way to minimize what he had done. 3 lives, the record showed, not 4. 3 counts of murder plus 1 technicality. Another place
Horse's
where the
butt.
reality of his actions was diluted, softened, diminished. It is telling that Chris accepted that framing without protest. He did not insist that Niko be named as a victim. He did not challenge the wording, because for Chris, minimization was survival. Every reduction of responsibility, every softened detail was one more wall between.
He's like those people that tell themselves lies and they believe the lies. Like they'd be like, I'm a stud. You look like a 2. Like, I don't know what, like, it's almost like your ego is this big, but his package is like this big. Like, they have this egocentric kind of aura where it's like, yeah, I'm all that kind of thing, but they're actually not. They lie to themselves, but soothes themselves, but they're actually not. And they think about that mentally too. I'm mentally smart. You're actually not.
Between himself and the truth. The guilty plea ended the trial, but it did not end the questions. It did not
Keep coming.
explain why. It did not explain how a father could carry out such an act. It simply closed the door before those answers could be demanded in open court. And so, in the end, the plea deal gave both sides something. Shanann's family received closure. Chris received escape, not from prison,
They can forgive, but they can never forget.
but from the stage where his lies would have finally collapsed in public view. If justice means truth, what kind of justice do we call it when the guilty man never has to explain why? In February 2019, months after his sentencing, investigators flew to Wisconsin to speak with Chris Watts one last time. The trial was over, the cameras were gone, he had nothing left to lose. And that's when the truth, or at least his final version of it,
Ethan.
emerged. Chris admitted that Shanann never harmed the children. That lie had
Not
been
at first.
discarded. He admitted he ended her life after an argument. But then came the revelation no one had anticipated. Bella and Celeste were still alive when he drove them to the oil site. For over an hour, the girls sat in the back seat of his work truck. At their feet lay their mother's body, wrapped in bedding. Chris claimed they were quiet, maybe half asleep, maybe holding on to each other. Here's the loophole.
Coddling each
If the
other.
girls were alive for that entire drive, where is the evidence? Investigators never released findings of DNA, fluids, or fibers from the truck.
That is true. You can't tell me that nothing fell from Shanann if she was back there. He apparently defecated, so I don't know.
Truck's interior. No traces that confirmed the girl's presence during that ride. Was that evidence sealed? Was it overlooked? Or does this mean Chris's
Never
story, even in prison,
analyzed.
was still incomplete? Psychologists studying this case described Chris's behavior as compartmentalization. He divided the crime into stages in his mind. At home, the argument, the act, the silence. In the truck, just a drive. At the site, disposal. He told each part as if it were disconnected, each horror sealed off in its own mental box.
But reality doesn't divide so neatly. For Bella and Celeste, there was no compartment. They were present. They saw. Bella, in particular, understood enough to speak. Her final words, Chris admitted, were, "Daddy, no."
And I hope it haunts him.
Those two words are not just haunting, they are psychologically shattering. Because they reveal the rupture of trust in real time. A child recognizing betrayal at the hands of the person meant to protect her most. For Chris, remembering those words wasn't just recounting, it was reliving. He admitted he hears them when he tries to sleep. Psychologists call this intrusive recall, when traumatic memories break through the mind's defenses. Unlike guilt, which can be rationalized, intrusive recall is punishment the brain delivers to itself. And yet, even here, Chris avoided full confrontation. He described covering Cece's mouth and nose with his hands. He described Bella watching from the truck, waiting her turn. But the way he spoke was flat, detached, as if narrating someone else's actions. That's another defense, dissociation, speaking about himself as though he were outside of his own body, separating the I from the act.
This is what makes the Wisconsin confession so disturbing. It gave more detail, it closed some gaps, but it also created new contradictions. Why no forensic truck evidence? Why so little emotion in the retelling? Why
All
admit
of the stuff.
enough to shock,
Man.
but still leave shadows over the timeline? Perhaps the answer lies in the psychology of minimization once again. By giving investigators something worse than expected, the girls alive in the truck, Chris could present himself as finally honest, even as he held back other truths. A strategy not to redeem himself, but to control the story one last time. Forensic experts still debate how much of that confession was truth and how much was narrative management. But one thing is certain, Bella's words, "Daddy, no," will echo longer than any courtroom record or prison sentence. They are the moment the mask fell completely and the reality of Chris Watts could never be hidden again. What does it say about a man when the words that haunt him most are not the silence of guilt, but the voice of a daughter? What does it say about a man when the words that haunt him most are not the silence of guilt, but the voice of a daughter begging him to stop?
Idiot.
Every crime leaves behind a trail of questions. Some are answered by evidence, some are answered by confessions. But in the case of Chris Watts, the most important question was never answered at all. Why? Chris gave many versions. At first, he said Shanann had harmed the girls, and he reacted. Later, he said he snapped during an argument. In Wisconsin, he admitted the children were alive in the truck, but insisted he didn't know what came over him.
Right.
3 different explanations, none of them complete, none of them satisfying. Psychologists point to this as motive collapse. When the act itself is so extreme, so destructive, the mind cannot produce a coherent narrative to justify it. Instead, fragments appear, excuses, minimizations, half-truths. The story changes, not
because the facts have changed, but because the offender's psyche cannot tolerate a single, stable explanation. And in Chris's case, the contradictions reveal even more. If it was just rage at Shanann, why kill Bella and Celeste?
Exactly.
If it was just to pursue a new relationship, why risk a crime so elaborate,
Because Nicole didn't want kids.
so guaranteed to fail? If it was just escape, why leave so many traces behind? The truth may be simpler and darker. Chris Watts may not have had a rational motive at all. His crime may have been the final expression of a man who had spent his entire life avoiding confrontation, avoiding honesty, avoiding responsibility, until the only escape he could imagine was total erasure. This is what criminologists call annihilation logic. When a man cannot tolerate losing control of his life, he destroys everyone who reflects that loss back at him. Shanann, outspoken and demanding accountability. Bella, resisting him in the final moment. Cece, joyful and alive in ways he could no longer stand to face. Even unborn Niko, symbol of the future he was too weak to claim. And yet, even with that framework, the why remains incomplete. Because no explanation can account for a father silencing his daughters, a husband silencing his wife, a man choosing extermination over honesty. Perhaps that is the greatest loophole of all. The missing motive. The silence at the center of the case. Chris Watts will spend the rest of his life in prison. Shanann's family will spend the rest of their lives grieving. But the unanswered why lingers like an open wound. We can point to finances, to an affair, to personality traits, to psychological defenses. But none of that bridges the gap between thought and act. None of that explains how a man who smiled at his neighbors could carry his daughters in the back of a truck, knowing exactly what awaited them. Some crimes resist explanation. Some motives collapse under their own emptiness. And sometimes, the most terrifying truth is that there is no truth at all, just a void where meaning should be. We expect monsters to roar, but sometimes they whisper, sometimes they smile, and sometimes they live quietly among us until the mask finally breaks.
His was incinerated. Well, Chris, you could try to find every loophole to try to get out, say it wasn't you, but it was you. We know it's you. You're not going anywhere, Chris. Stop trying. I'm seeing all these things that, oh, Chris is going to try to get out in 2026, or there's no way this man is getting out. 2029, we're going after NK, okay? We're going after her because she needs to be held accountable. Like this other girl with the pastor and the wife that he just shot his wife to be with the mistress. He sent a text message her saying it's almost done. She knew about the murders. She should be held accountable for knowing and not saving. She could have called and said, yeah, this guy's going to do this, save him. If Nicole knew this, she could have called the police and saved them. But instead, it chose the route that me. I want to be happy. I want a three-way. I want butt stuff. I want all this stuff. Plus, I want rocks. I'm a geologist. That's literally her mindset. Leave your guys' comments down below on your thoughts of this whole ordeal, the loopholes that he's trying to portray to get out of prison in 2026. This man's not going to get out in 2026, 2027, 2028, 2029. He's not ever getting out. They can throw as much money as they want at this. He's not getting out. We're trying to go after NK. He's going to be in prison until the death or his death. Get over it, Chris. If he's ever watching this, I mean, they do get computer time, so I don't know if they're allowed to watch YouTube videos, but I've been told that he has, but again, told and seeing are two different things. Again, thank you guys for being here and watching with me and reacting. Please have a great day. Take care. Be safe. God bless. Keep nerding on, and we will see you guys in that next video.